Okay, let's talk a little bit about plant production and how people are involved with that. This is kind of a summary of almost the entire semester. We've really focused on plant interactions. We've talked about plant interactions with other organisms. We've talked about plant interactions with their physical environment. We've talked a little bit about plant interactions with people as well, and particularly when it came to people and culture and how we utilize plants and derive enjoyment from them and things like that. But the reality is, if you look at our cropping systems, and remember, this is cropping systems from all different perspectives. So your cropping system could be greenhouses, landscapes, turfs, or agronomic fields, right? These are things that we are managing. We sometimes get enjoyment out of that, but a lot of times we're making a living off of that too. All of these systems have their own ecology. The thing is we also interact with these systems in non-ecological ways. Money influences things, right? We need money to buy the land. We need money to buy equipment, to buy materials, to do operations, to pay people to work. So money often influences how we make land management decisions. The values and attitudes of not just the people who are managing the land, but the people who see that management happening. So, for example, look at golf courses. Golf courses utilize a lot of water. Golf courses utilize a lot of chemicals because it's very stressful to grow little tiny baby grasses that people can walk on and play golf on. And golfers expect that course to behave in certain ways. And when people hear about things like, oh, well, the golf courses use all these pesticides, we shouldn't do that ever. Well, that changes that particular game. Should golf courses pay attention to how much water and pesticides they're using? Perhaps. Are there ways that they could do things differently? Perhaps. The history of land usage, demographic trends. This is a big one, demographic trends. So think about the number of people who are involved in food production right now versus the number of people who were involved in food production, say 100 or 150 years ago. Land usage. We need agrarian land to produce agrarian crops, but we also need land for homes and parks and recreation and all those sorts of things. Political issues come into play. Policies come into play. So there's constant change in policies and things that are influencing how we're looking at things. Every crop production system evolved within their society, their culture, their particular understanding, their history, the political systems. So we're no different in that respect from every other country. And every country is a little bit different in how they view cropping systems. See, we take a very simple example of primitive societies. Often, the vast majority of a village might be involved with production in some way, whether that's planting, harvesting, or preparation afterwards. Most crops are mainly food crops. They grow multiple crops, so within the village, they grow everything that they need, and they're growing in small amounts. So rather than monocropping an entire orchard, they may have 2 or 3 fruit trees. They're limited trading. Compare that with how industrialized societies often do things. It's more difficult in an industrialized society to do the things that you might do in a primitive society. We monoculture because we need to be efficient, right? Despite all the downfalls of monoculturing, it is very efficient. It allows us to develop specialized equipment, and it has allowed us to not need 40% of American society being involved in food production. For better or worse, that's some of the things that's happened, right? The reality is now probably 97% of Western society has little to no contact with crops, with the exception of buying them in the grocery store. They don't understand where they come from. And they don't understand that they're still involved with these things. Is a homeowner mowing their lawn? Are they applying pesticides to their lawn? Are they going to a garden center and buying a tomato plant? That is conscious manipulation of their own little ecosystem, right? They destroyed part of an ecosystem to make a garden and created their own little ecosystem. Can we prevent destruction as much as possible? Maybe, but we have to understand that everything we do causes an impact to everything else. That impact is neither, I'm going to repeat this, I've said this over and over, that impact is not necessarily a good impact or a bad impact, it is just an impact. And so we have to decide how we want to have that impact. And can we downplay the negative impacts while upplaying the positive impacts? Most of our plants nowadays, we say, oh, let's get out into nature, but our yards are not natural in the sense that that's what it looked like 200 years ago. Most of our plants are placed on our properties. Most of our plants are specifically placed on our farms, and this allows for weeds to take advantage. Think of the white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer get along really, really well in cities. They've really learned to adapt to city living. And weeds are no different. They've learned to adapt to the conditions that we have given them. So that's an unintended consequence where those particular plants, say dandelions, are completely taking advantage of that. None of those plants were there originally. That is a fully constructed landscape. So all of those plants are now an ecosystem in and of themselves, even though it's a different ecosystem than what might have been there. We've talked about this. We've talked about plants give us food, they give us pleasure, they clean their air, they give us fibers and all kinds of different things. What we haven't really talked about is that we can utilize plants to alter our environment, our home environment. We can utilize plants to reduce crime. There's all kinds of studies that show that if you have green spaces in inner cities, you have less crime than if you don't have green spaces. There are studies that show by proper placement of trees around the property, you can increase the property value and you can change the heating and cooling system of the property. I'm not gonna read this whole thing, but basically what it boils down to is if you have trees on your property, you can have up to 27% more value on your home. Think about this. Do they modify our behavior? Have you heard stories about people living in trees to prevent that tree being destroyed to build a road? Earlier there was a video of a town that spent several $100,000 to move a tree 1,500 feet so that it wouldn't be killed because that tree had been there for several hundred years. That's modification of behavior. Does it make monetary sense to move that tree? Probably not. Does it make emotional and sentimental sense to move that tree? It probably did. We tend to view land differently in this country than in other countries. So if you take a look at the differences, in England in particular, it's not that we don't view farmland as part of our history, but we tend to look at it as these are farmers' issues, these are office worker issues, these are poor folk issues, these are rich folk issues, rather than thinking of that all combined. This is my land. That's our attitude. I bought this land. This is mine, right? And in England they don't have that. You'll often find farms with pathways going through them, and the public just walking through the farm. So if we take a look at this farm, this is in England. I pulled this off the internet. Notice the pathways. Those pathways are there for people of the community to walk the farm. Imagine how different our production systems might be and the challenges we might be able to overcome by having some pathways through some of our farms with signage to help people learn what's happening. There are some exceptions to this. In the Cuyahoga National Park, they're trying to do some rethinking of farming, and they have allowed right now I think about 10 or 12 farmers to farm within the park, all different crops, and they have some special rules. But this is trying to get folks to see what farming actually is. We've talked a little bit about ethnobotany. I think we've kind of talked about it in relationship to other societies, but the reality is we have an ethnobotany. We have a history with plants and plant production and our food availability and the food choices and how that food is distributed. Ethnobotany is the study of all of these crops within a culture, right? So think about where you're from and how plants are produced and the relationships that you as a grower might have with the plants that you're growing. That could be a house plant. That could be a peony that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation. That could be a family farm that's been in your family for decades or for hundreds of years. We often think of ethnobotany as primitive or historic societies. Why? Because we find things like this. This was a man, a mummy that was preserved. They are guessing he lived somewhere between 3400 and 3100 BCE. So that's, you're talking 5,000 years ago, right? I want to go down here and talk about there. If you look right here in the middle where it says, in 2009, a CAT scan revealed the stomach had shifted upward, but analysis of the contents revealed partly digested remains of ibex meat. Whole grains were found. He had a few slices of dried fatty meat, probably a bacon that came from a wild goat. They found 2 meals, chamois meat, red deer, herb bread, roots, and fruits. So they found that this individual had a lot of relationships with plants. And we were able to learn a lot about what the types of things that they would eat at the time. It's a little more difficult for us to recognize our own ethnobotany. And in particular, the U.S., we're really, really good at absorbing other cultures and other foods. And across the country, we have a huge country geographically. So across the country, there's all these different personal preferences that come into play. But we can look at rituals. We can look at what we plant at certain times of the year. We can look at new trends. Buy local, go native. Those are all things that have happened in the last, probably more so in the last decade or so. That's a change in how things were. This use less pesticides is a change. The plant for pollinators is a change. So these are all cultural changes that are happening within our relationship with plants. When we're looking at plants and when we're looking at ecology, we have to talk about conservation. The conservation could be conservation of a golf course, conservation of park systems, conservation of metro or natural parks, conservation of family farms, conservation of family greenhouses. So there's lots and lots of ways to look at it. These are 3 possible ways. One possible thing is people could just use as much of the natural resources without spending any of their own money. Maybe we should privatize everything and allow the owners to make their own decisions, and they would do what's best for the land because it's their land. Maybe we could appeal to good nature for conservation of unknown resources. None of these are right. None of these are wrong. It's just personal opinions. You can probably come up with 100 different views of conservation and what that means to you in relationship to your views of ecology, land use, farming, landscaping, turf, etc., etc. So let's take a look at this. We've talked about sustainability a little bit. This garden is several hundred years old. It takes a lot of work to maintain it. This garden looks exactly the same as it did 400 years ago. Is that sustainable? Is that conservation? Here is something called the Keukenhof. The Keukenhof is a Dutch area where they do millions of bulbs every year, and people come to it every year to walk the lands and see the beauty of these bulbs.
Welkom in Keukenhof 2020.
And it's a little bit different this year.
Mijn naam is Bart Siemerink, ik ben directeur van Keukenhof. En ik heet je welkom als onze eerste virtuele bezoeker. Als jij niet naar Keukenhof kunt komen, brengen wij Keukenhof naar jou. De komende weken nemen wij je mee naar de mooiste plekjes van Keukenhof. Dit is mijn favoriete plek, de Bloemenheuvel. Afgelopen herfst hebben we hier 60.000 bollen geplant. Afgelopen herfst hebben we hier 60.000 3 soorten krokussen, 26 soorten tulpen, 3 soorten krokussen, voor maar liefst 8 weken bloei. Kijk nou deze mooie rode tulp, de showwinner. Kijk nou deze mooie rode tulp, elk jaar opnieuw. En de kleur rood is ontzettend belangrijk elk jaar opnieuw. En de kleur rood is ontzettend belangrijk voor ons. Het paars en het wit van de krokussen. Maar rood hebben we niet, alleen in de tulpen. En het wit van de krokussen. En dit jaar zijn ze gelukkig vroeg, want we hebben een warme winter gehad. En dit jaar zijn ze gelukkig vroeg, want we hebben een warme winter gehad. Over een paar weken bloeit hier zelfs de zwarte tulp. Over een paar weken bloeit hier zelfs de zwarte tulp. De Queen of Night. En er is nog zoveel moois te zien in Keukenhof de komende periode. En er is nog zoveel moois te zien in Keukenhof de komende periode. Volg ons vooral online.
I look at this picture and I see beauty. Some might see, that's just farmland. But I see this is equally as beautiful as any flower garden to me, and it's got an ecosystem, it's got a relationship, and it has people that have a relationship with it. It is part of our culture.